And we should also be live now. So thanks to anyone who's tuning in on social media. Happy to have you join us. All right. Oh, still got people coming in. Emily, would you be able to let people in since you're the co-host as they kind of log on? If I start with the intro, would you be able to do that? Okay, cool. So welcome everyone. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the program director for the Interfaith Center. We're located at the Miami University campus in Oxford, Ohio. And our mission is to invite people of diverse religious, spiritual, and secular worldviews to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and to build friendships and relationships, as well as to unify them around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. I'm really happy to welcome Sara and Emily here today for the Disneyfication of the climate crisis. Sara Austin is a visiting assistant professor at Miami University, which is also in Ohio. Her interest in race, gender, and childhood identity has yielded articles in Transformative Works and Cultures, The Lion and the Unicorn, The Looking Glass, New Perspectives in Children's Literature, and the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics. Her current research explores monstrosity as a cultural metaphor for child identity. Emily Midkiff teaches children's literature, YA literature, and reading instruction at the University of North Dakota. Her research interests include children's and YA media, speculative fiction, and visual storytelling. In her forthcoming book about science fiction for young children, she presents the results of her interdisciplinary studies on the genre and young people who read it. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys now. Thanks to everyone for being here.
All right. Just hit present. All right. Thank you, and thank you for having us. We wanted to start with actually a spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about Moana, Frozen and Frozen 2, and we'll be talking about them from beginning to end without any regard for giving things away. So if you haven't seen them yet, you have been warned. So after the release of Frozen in 2013, the State Department's special representative on the Arctic asked Disney about collaborating on a film about global warming. No official collaboration emerged from that, but you could say that the real villain in Frozen, Moana, and Frozen 2 is climate change itself. The climate destruction in these films may be magical, but it's caused and resolved by humans. And as a result, these princess films can offer the youngest viewers an introduction to issues of global warming, although they don't always follow through on their green promise. The movies, not the young viewers. So we're going to look at these three films today and use them to answer the question, can children's media that is used to make a profit also teach ecological lessons?
So we want to start with a little bit of history on the environment and children's culture. Thinking about the relationship between childhood and the environment, or encouraging children to protect the environment, is not new. Our current conception of childhood, what childhood is and looks like, comes largely from the Victorian period. And starting in this period, children were seen as closer to nature. So you have novels like The Secret Garden, which was written in 1912. You have the beginning of the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts movements in Britain, the US, and Canada. You have periodicals such as Boy's Life, or the boys' own paper and the girls' own paper, and then romantic art movements of the 18th and 19th century. And all of these connect childhood exclusively to nature, right? The idea that children are better than adults because they are somehow closer to the natural world. More contemporary versions of this look like Dr. Seuss's The Lorax or Captain Planet, which some of us may remember from the early 90s. And Captain Planet is particularly interesting because the tagline is, "The power is yours." And this promotes individual responsibility for climate change, right? So in this conception, it's not climate change is a problem that we all have to solve. It's that the individual child has the power and the responsibility to deal with ecological devastation and to care for the environment. This is also important because Indigenous characters have always been a part of ecological children's literature. Thinking about like Island of the Blue Dolphins and Julie of the Wolves, right? Indigenous characters and Native characters have been understood as closer to nature, and in some cases, unfortunately, less human than the white protagonist characters. And they work as mediators, helping the children in these books understand the speech of animals or, grow closer to nature. And we see this in the Disney movies in the first Frozen film, Kristoff. He dresses in what is traditional Sami clothing, which are the indigenous peoples of what would be the fictional Arendelle, and he talks to and for his reindeer, Sven. He's also raised by rock trolls, so he's like not quite human in the familial sense. And then he's always depicted as a little bit uncomfortable in like civilized clothing and human society. There's a kind of grown-up joke in Frozen 2 about him wearing leather. Well, sort of brush past. But both Moana and Frozen 2 attempt to remedy this, right? Because there's a fair amount of conversation after the first Frozen movie comes out about Sami erasure, that the opening song that they use is actually a Sami melody, and then Kristoff is dressed in traditional Sami clothing. And so for the second two movies, right, Moana and Frozen 2, Disney does take this seriously. And they create the Oceanic Story Trust for Moana, right, where they talk to members of Pacific Islander communities to try to get the mythology right in so much as you can, because these are multiple different traditions. And they cast Indigenous actors or AAPI actors, right, Asian American Pacific Islander actors with ties to that community. And then for Frozen 2, they actually consult the Sami parliaments of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and the Sami Council, right? So they are making efforts to be more inclusive of Indigenous peoples in those second two films. We want to talk specifically about eco-pedagogy in these movies. And eco-pedagogy is a term that means literally teaching about the environment, but Greta Gard has 3 criteria, and we find these are really useful for thinking about whether or not something is effective eco-pedagogy. Her first criteria is that children's literature is effective if it challenges the binary of human and nature and the resulting power imbalance of humans over nature, right? So it can't be humans do the thing, nature suffers. We have to sort of break down that humans, nature, power structure. The second thing she says is that it has to solve environmental issues through community rather than by the child alone. So unfortunately, Captain Planet's The Power Is Yours doesn't work here, right? This needs to be a community effort. We can't put it on one hero or heroine or chief's daughter to save the day. We all have to work together. And third, it gives nature its own subjectivity and agency without the sort of hero damsel in distress, right? Nature can't be this thing that we have to swoop in and save. It has to exist as a character in its own right. So those are the 3 criteria, and we're going to come back to them throughout the talk to evaluate how effective these films are. The last thing I want to point out before we really dive into the movies is that Disney has been weaving eco-pedagogy and eco-criticism into its films for a while. Think about like Princess and the Frog from 2009 and Brave from 2012, right? These have balance of nature elements to them, but they often align the natural world not with the princess, but with this old sort of witchy crone character like Mama Odie or the Witch of the Woods, right? Who isn't actually named in Brave. And the movies that we're talking about today, Frozen, Moana, and Frozen 2, are different because they shift that relationship between nature and a character from that old witch character who's like sort of magic to the princess characters, right? The ones that we know young viewers are supposed to identify with because Disney makes millions selling Halloween costumes and t-shirts and just regular go into preschool costumes and pajamas that allow children to embody those characters, right? So it's important to think about these movies that cast the avatar for the child in the movie, the princess, as the one who supports and protects nature.
So if we if we think about these three films chronologically, Moana came out in between the two Frozens, and with each film, Disney's representation of climate change got a little more complex. So in Frozen, in the first one, 2030, the whole magical winter, straightforward literary, pathetic fallacy. In Moana, Maui claims to have stolen Te Fiti's heart so that humankind could create new things, hinting at the industrial causes of ecological devastation. So we're getting a little closer there. But then in Frozen 2, in 2019, the most recent one, this movie highlights the political motives behind climate destruction. Elsa and Anna's grandfather chose to benefit his kingdom through natural destruction that would harm other nations and even later generations. Disney gets surprisingly close to real climate issues here, although they avoid representing the real corporate culprits of climate change by locating the problem in the actions of just one king. So there's progress here, but all three films still fail to engage with Guard's first characteristic, that challenging the binary of problems solved by people. The cause for concern is just a disruption to everyday life rather than being concerned about the actual problems with nature itself. And humans win over nature by the end of the films. Now, these films also all fail at Guard's second criteria, solving environmental issues through community engagement. In each case, a young woman, who is that avatar for the child, solves the crisis without community help. Elsa learns to control her ice powers, Moana restores the heart, Anna destroys the dam. The community isn't involved, and the parental generation even hinders the quest every now and again. The communities in these films aren't evil or anything. They seem like loving people who help each other through the crisis, but they don't have a role in designing the solutions. That's put on just those princess characters. This focus on individual action allows Disney to avoid depicting the roles of government and corporations in the climate crisis. In this way, they can produce and market these green films without having to account for their own role in climate change. And this isn't too far from when we see things like individual calls to recycle and help pollution and not large-scale corporate calls. However, the films do satisfy Guard's third criterion, giving nature agency and not casting it as a damsel in distress. Elements of the natural world are actual characters in the films, very literally. And this might be what Disney excels at the most because it's the one that translates most directly into material culture production. Singing snowmen and glittery ocean slime, cute little purple fire lizards, all translate directly into toy sales in a way that community engagement does not. So the films do show some gradual improvement as they go through time, but they still only satisfy 1 out of 3 of those criteria that we pointed out. Now, they do, however, contribute to children's education about climate change in other, perhaps unintentional ways.
So one of the things that we find most interesting about these films is that they could be called eco-feminist. And specifically, Cheryl Glotfelty defines ecofeminism as a theoretical discourse whose theme is the link between the oppression of women and the domination of nature. So basically the idea that people who are mean to women because they're women are also bad to nature, right? That's how it's sort of simplified, but that's more or less how these films often portray ecofeminism. So the princess characters become the heroines, protecting the natural world, and the male villains treat the natural world and the female characters badly, right? So the way that they treat women and the way they treat the natural world sort of align. And we have some images here. The first is Moana, right? Initially, Maui sort of ignores her. He doesn't want to help her. He calls her a princess. He's going to strand her on an island and steal her boat. He comes around at the end, and he's not really a villain, but he is sort of unhelpful at the beginning of the film. And his unhelpfulness is linked to what he thinks about her as a young woman. In the middle of the slide is Prince Hans, who seems like a good guy, but he's tricking you the whole time. He's secretly planning to marry Anna and then murder Elsa so he can take over the kingdom. And his awfulness is connected to both the way that he treats women and his sort of unhelpfulness generally in trying to stop the winter in Arendelle. And then on the far right is the Duke of Weaselton. He's the joke in the movie is he's the Duke of Weaselton. And he's probably the best example of this because he's comic relief, he's awful, he's dumb, he dances like a chicken, and he freaks out about Elsa, monster, monster. And it's unclear how much of his dislike of her is about the fact that she has magic ice powers and how much of it is just she's a woman in power and he's not quite able to grasp that. So Anna and Elsa in Frozen 2 also learn that their mother is a member of the North Uldra, which is the film's sort of fictionalized version of the Sami people, right? And so they have a familial connection to the racial and environmental oppression of the North Uldra through the female line. Their grandfather is the one who built the dam, who's intentionally harming indigenous people. Their mother's parents are indigenous. And so this reinforces the connection in the film between race and gender and environmental concerns. Anna's defense of Elsa and Moana's ability to recognize Te Fiti and heal her, and then Anna's destruction of the dam all suggest the radical potential of female and feminine approaches to environmental issues, empathy between women and other women, empathy between women and the environment. And specifically in Moana, and you can see at the bottom, these are the little Funko Pop images of Te Kā and Te Fiti. Moana sees Te Kā, right? And she approaches her and she sings, "They have stolen the heart from inside you. This does not define you. This is not who you are. I know who you are." And then she touches her forehead to Te Kā's and she whispers, "Who you really are," demonstrating that she can see beyond the monstrous appearance to the hurt that has been done to the natural world, and she has empathy for it. And it's this love and empathy that allows Te Kā to transform back into Te Fiti once the heart is restored.
And another related thing that we think these three films actually do well is that in all three films, environmental conservation is increasingly portrayed as an extension of romantic or familial love. So Frozen begins with the standard Disney fairy tale structure of Anna meeting and falling for a prince through a duet. But then he turns out to be villainous. Besides this being a self-aware joke Disney's making at their own expense, the theme of Anna's evolving understanding of true love as more than romantic opens a space to explore familial love. And all three films actually lack a romantic love interest for the female character who's most closely aligned with nature, Elsa and Moana, suggesting that love for nature almost replaces romance in the plot for those characters. So climate change here works mostly on a metaphoric level, helping the child audience visualize how love is not just romance. Frozen uses Elsa's ice powers to represent a journey to self-love too, as well as sisterly love. And the eternal winter there symbolizes Anna and Elsa's relationship, which thaws when Elsa learns to accept both herself and Anna's love. And then Frozen 2 goes on to make Elsa a literal nature spirit, completing that transformation of nature and specifically climate change from a metaphor to an object of love. So by the end, the sisters are even inviting nature spirits to their family game, narration of true love that began in the first film, from romantic to familial to a love of nature itself. And Moana pushes the representation of climate change as a metaphor for familial love even further, perhaps, by making the climate part of the family unit. And the ocean is a character itself, and Moana's grandmother is reincarnated as a giant manta ray. Moana reaches her own self-identity and self-love through her love of family and her love of her environment, which is demonstrated probably most potently in that climactic conversation with her grandmother's ghost, in which she's prompted to think about who she is in relationship to her environment. And then in turn, later, Moana steps into her grandmother's role in that previous conversation to remind Te Fiti who she is through her relationships as well, performing that role of family for Te Fiti while restoring the natural balance.
So the films themselves are really only one part of Disney's ecological messaging. And so now we want to turn to talking about the other portion of the ecological messaging, which is merchandising. Disney's marketing platform for the three films reinforces the film's connection between self-love, familial love, and the love of nature. But the themes are not represented the same way in the products that Disney produces and sells. Reusable items meant to let the consumer, the child, embody the characters, emphasize self-love and messages about personal truth, actualization, and destiny. So we have a t-shirt here from Frozen. But the t-shirts from Frozen 1 and 2, the phone cases, the tote bags, feature slogans such as "Believe in the journey," "Live your truth," "Fearless," and "Be brave," "Be free," "Be you." Similarly, Moana's clothing and tote bags says things like "Find your own way" and "Destined for greatness." In contrast to the reusable products, disposable products emphasize nature. So reusable products, family, self-actualization; disposable products, nature. So we have here a paper plate to give you a sense of kind of what they look like. But Frozen sells entire party kits, right, that you can buy on the Disney store. And they include things like disposable tablecloths, one of which is printed with the outline of Olaf surrounded by leaves and a colorful border with Elsa, Anna, Kristoff, and Sven underneath the words "Nature is magical." Other paper goods, such as the plates and cups, feature the characters against a forest background surrounded by blowing leaves. Moana's paper goods are similar. Moana and Maui standing against bright stylized suns, flowers, and the ocean. In each case, the visual communication of the film's themes are the main characters surrounded by nature in a film-specific color palette. Self-love and non-romantic relationship themes appear on durable, reusable items, but natural themes and settings are literally disposable. So nature is important, but not that important. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the moment at the end of Frozen 2 that we think sort of embodies how Disney tries to get around some of this ecological messaging, right? So we can see the importance of preserving nature downplayed in moments of the movies that directly relate to merchandising. In Frozen 2, Elsa comes back to life just in time to ride a water horse. There's a horse made of water here. Spirit to the front of the tidal wave that's going to destroy Arendelle Castle, and she freezes it, right? And she spares the town from flooding and destroying the castle. So this suggests that if one has the intention to make a sacrifice to correct the damage done to nature and natural defenders, such as Indigenous people, then that's good enough. even if the sacrifice is ultimately not made. Like if you meant to do it, that's okay. The last-minute rescue of Arendelle removes the consequences and makes Anna's destruction of the dam a painless sacrifice. So the Frozen 2 Arendelle Castle playset is this huge, complex toy that you can see at the bottom of the slide here on the right side. It has 11 rooms, suited to 2.5-inch figures, and rings in at $140, making it the most expensive toy in the Shop Disney store. Commercials around the release of Frozen 2 show children playing pleasantly and gently with the castle. So Disney's using this to create a very specific idea of childhood. If you buy this toy, your kids will sit in a room and be quiet. Destroying this icon within the film would jeopardize the sale of the commercial product or potentially script a type of play that Disney's idyllic commercials are not likely to endorse, right? You're not going to buy this thing for your kids if you think you're going to hear lots of crashes from the other room with this $140 toy. So the destruction of the playset by like toppling it over during play is not a thing that Disney is pushing, right, through the way that they sell the product. The Shop Disney description of the castle even says children will want to, quote, recreate their favorite Frozen 2 scenes, implying that the destruction of the castle in the film is outside of scripted play for the toy, right? So they're not going to destroy it in the movie because then they can't sell it to parents as a thing that will keep your kids quiet. And they can't sell it to kids as a thing that you can recreate your favorite movie scenes from. So the Arendelle Castle, along with other film merchandise, demonstrates in glittery musical plastic what Natalie Optebeck explains about children's eco-literature in general. In children's publishing and print media generally, there is a telling disconnect between a common sense save the forest narrative and the material actualities of mass production and everyday shopping, right? The way that we make and sell copies of the Lorax is very different from the message of the text. Disney's marketing practices demonstrate that not only is this corporation unable or unwilling to separate the ecological message from the eco-destructive material practice, right? Making and selling the plastic things and the disposable goods, but that the practice often taints the message. Disney can continue the destructive practices of branded disposable merchandise as long as that merchandise emphasizes the characters in nature and therefore encourages children to love nature and learn to resolve the ecological crisis sometime in the future when it's more convenient.
So in total, Frozen, Moana, and Frozen 2 function in many ways as a trilogy of musical princess films with those climate disaster messages. They invite children to identify with the iconic princesses and their heroic journeys to save their communities from ecological disasters. And they even include surprisingly radical eco-feminist content and slowly improving representations of Indigenous people. However, Disney never completely achieves effective eco-pedagogy because they haven't resolved the inherent conflict between that ecological messaging and their own destructive marketing. So the eco-critical potential here of these new princesses is promising, but damaged by Disney's goals as a corporation concerned ultimately more with seeking profit than with encouraging children to be ecological activists in the face of climate change. And we have an article coming out soon, a special issue of The Lion and the Unicorn that has even more details than we've been able to talk about here today. Although feel free to ask us some questions in the Q&A.
Thank you both so much. So we're going to open up for the Q&A now. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat, and we can moderate it. Actually, looks like there's already one question in the chat. So if we as parents refuse to buy the merch stuff, are we good to still watch the movies, or are the movies still bad role models for the children?
I'll start and then let Emily jump in. So basically, I think our argument isn't that the movies are bad or even that the merch is bad. It's more that, man, capitalism always gets us. That it's really difficult, if not impossible, for us to, or for a big corporation whose goal is to make money, right, to make any kind of media that is going to be explicitly ecologically friendly, right? Like, I don't know that there's any way for a big conglomerate, especially something the size of Disney, whose goal is profit, to do that. And that doesn't mean that you can't watch the movies or you can't buy the castle and enjoy the castle and play with the castle. It's more a question of being aware of the fact that capitalism, man.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, if you look at this with a really optimistic point of view, they're doing surprisingly well, better than they used to, even. And you can see in that progression through the three movies that they're getting a little bit more complex and a little bit more into the nuances as they go. And there's just little things that they could have done better, but we're not really surprised that they didn't at the same time. But they might be really fruitful opportunities to talk to kids directly about. I mean, it'd be a great opportunity to talk to your kid about, well, what would have happened if the castle did get destroyed? Well, would that have been okay? Would that have been worth the cost?
Looks like there's another question in the chat from Rebecca. Just wondering about the end of Frozen 2. The soldiers help Anna destroy the dam, and even before that, both the soldiers and the indigenous people of the forest help both Anna and Elsa. Does this not count as community support, especially since we see moments throughout where they have to decide to help or not?
I think that would be the case if it weren't Anna's decision. She had to decide that she was going to go destroy the dam. She didn't bring it to a council of them and say, what are we going to do about this dam? It fell on her directly. And before that, it was on Elsa specifically to reveal that history that has this very personal weight, at least in pinch points in the film.
Yeah. And I think part of the struggle too there is the way that we tell stories is often very centered on an individual hero or heroine, or at most two or three, right? And so it's going to be difficult for, a major film or even a book to work within that story structure that's very comprehensible to small children and large groups of people and appeals to large groups of people and does wink, wink, nod, nod, 80s reference songs at the same time without focusing on one individual person who's largely responsible for those decisions. Let's see.
Are there other questions? You're also welcome to jump in and ask a question directly.
We've got one here about Disney versus Pixar and Studio Ghibli versus the environmentalism in children's culture there, with Studio Ghibli in particular having more of a critique of capitalism than Disney does. Well, the story structures in Studio Ghibli films are also radically different all the time anyway. They tend to have groups of children rather than one child often working together, and they don't tend to have that quest structure quite as much where one child has to go fix something. Often the plots are, if you think Totoro, just let's enjoy how quirky and wonderful the world is. So it is very different, I would say, than the way Disney approaches things.
Yeah, and even the films that are a little bit more questy, like Princess Mononoke, are explicitly ecological and
really dedicated to showing the nuance.
Yeah, and I think part of that also may be that Studio Ghibli has more of a connection to non-Western story structures, right? And also showcasing non-Western religious beliefs, which also align to respect for nature in different ways. So that may also be part of it. But now that Disney owns everything, who knows? Okay. Humor.
Yeah. Humor.
Sorry, I'm getting real close to my computer so I can read.
That's an interesting question. I mean, all three films certainly have their moment. marketed as funny. Necessarily, they're not marketed as humor movies. They've got that princess movie overall marketing scheme. But
Yeah, I mean,
nature is often kind of funny if you think about like Olaf being the humor and Hey Hey being the humor. A lot of the
I was going to say
natural sidekicks are often laughable in some ways.
Mm-hmm. One of the things Gard talks about that we didn't hear is that loving nature is very important too, right? Like that part of eco-pedagogy is respecting nature, but part of it is also loving nature. And so if nature is a cute little snowman that just wants to hug you and doesn't understand that he will melt in the summer, like that does make elements of nature much more lovable. So especially for an audience of small children, humor can be an important part of fostering a love for the natural world, right? Which is one of the prerequisites of eco-pedagogy. It's moving faster than I can keep up with it. I have to scroll back up to see.
I think
somebody asked about
getting
the
crossed.
And Marie writes, I thought this was part of what Disney did to include indigenous people, Sami people stories, the end of the dam. And I think it does, and I think it would have been a very different move if the North Voldra had destroyed the dam. Think about the messaging of that, what that would have meant. It wouldn't have been, some people talk about the film being a sort of reparations message, and it wouldn't have been that at all if they had done all of it, taking down the dam themselves. So their involvement definitely changes the metaphor of it in some ways, that they couldn't do it all themselves, but it's still mostly Anna, same time. And but obviously the council was involved in probably that decision as well. Although we don't know what went on behind those closed doors in those conversations.
Let's see.
Interesting question from Ted there.
Yeah.
I will let Sarah answer that.
So yes, queer eco-pedagogy, Greta Gard. She also has some stuff that's less focused on queer eco-pedagogy and more explicitly focused on the way that eco-pedagogy works in children's literature, which is what we're pulling from. I have not heard anything about Frozen and Elsa as a TERF. That's totally new to me. So that's the thing I'm going to be Googling when we're done here, because I've not heard that. That's news. I've heard Elsa's queer. I've seen lots and lots and lots of stuff about give Elsa a girlfriend, hashtag give Elsa a girlfriend, and promises that in Frozen 3, Elsa will have a girlfriend. That is
not the TERF thing. I hadn't heard that.
That is some nonsense, and I don't like it. Ew. Well, new hashtag, I guess, friends. Don't make Elsa a TERF. Stop it. This is kind of the point there, right? Like Disney, you can't have nice things. Like you can have a little bit of a nice thing, but then capitalism, it always gets you in the end. Like there's some element of the marketing that always just, it's like, nope, can't quite be there.
We've also been asked if we think Disney Plus will offer more opportunities for awareness, since those programs will come out more frequently than movies. I think it's certainly possible. The episodic things in particular are a very different structure, and they're more likely to have casts of characters, because you can have one episode focusing on a character and another episode focusing on another character. So I would say there's great potential there for making more community at least involved in the problems than in a film. Whether or not they'll take it remains to be seen.
It might be all Star Wars content all the time, or all rehashing 80s movies and cartoons. Like that's been, and not that I don't love that, but so far, right, the business model for Disney Plus has not been like, let's invest in specific social justice awareness initiatives. It's been like, let's sell people Baby Yoda.
And we've been asked to share our thoughts on how Disney aligns nature and magic throughout its 80 years of films, with often in the earlier films with middle-aged female witches and villains, and if we think there's an overall shift happening now and why.
Social pressure. I mean, and honest, so my like very jaded response to this is, yeah, Disney is definitely getting better in the way that they represent Indigenous cultures, in the way that they represent non-white princesses, in the way that they're responsive to issues of social justice and climate change. But they're not like that because they're good people. They're like that because that's what's going to sell the movies. That it's economic pressure, right? I mean, and you know, capitalism is where I always come back to in this. But I do think it's getting better, and it's getting better because the vast majority of the global audience is moving toward that's what we want to see. And so that's been the response.
Supply and demand. There is a demand for it.
Yeah. As to why it used to be middle-aged female witches, there's probably an eco-feminist answer about that, about the way that certain types of women who were very invested in nature were viewed at that particular historical moment.
Still, for decades and decades, it's probably more than decades, centuries, probably women who are too close to nature, not fitting in as well as they should be according to cultural ideals, end up villainized. We also have a question from Haley, continuing to ask about how Indigenous cultures are being portrayed in the film, quite literally trapped in the past as a result of imperialism and colonialism. Great metaphor there. And she asks, how have the readings of the way Indigenous scholars and activists responded to the films influenced our readings? She acknowledges that this is made complex by the way the white popular conversations about Indigenous cultures are diluted to nature plus wisdom in the past. Although, yeah, she says that it's interesting to think about it as a reparations metaphor that also kind of minimizes the North Ultra involvement. Yeah, they get to be there, but they don't ultimately get to be in any way involved in that destruction of the dams, soldiers and Anna.
Part of the problem
and then they're also great.
we had is that there's not a lot of Native criticism about these films.
There isn't. And there's also some interesting things that they managed to do right in Moana that they then didn't in Frozen 2, which was weird to us to see that, like, in Moana, they made sure to get a lot of specifically, if not Indigenous, at least descended from, with ties to Indigenous, at least local people to do the voice acting. And then they didn't do that at all for the Sami characters in Frozen 2. So Disney's kind of hit or miss in how they're doing that there. So there's people that have pointed that out. But there's not tons of criticism on this. Look into that. It's a ripe field for investigating.
Yeah, there's a little bit about Moana and the monomyth that happens, right? How Disney's taking a lot of different narratives from a lot of different Pacific Islander mythological traditions and cultures and sort of conglomerating them into one big myth. But it's like 3 articles, and they're not in a peer-reviewed journal situation because it's too new. They're in like sort of mass market publications. So part of it is there hasn't been a turnaround time for a lot of this, but there just isn't much yet. Soon, maybe. Okay.
If anyone wants to point us at anything in particular, please do.
Yeah.
Oh, this thing about Elsa being a TERF is from The Onion.
Oh, thank God. I was like, how did I not know anything about this? I was so panicked. How is this a thing? Don't give them ideas. All right. The people depicted in Moana would approve of the description of their story heritage. Again, they kind of like it's. There's concern about
a lot more of that Moana specifically. That a lot of people have spoken up for Moana and said this is not at all what Maui is like. So there's been a lot more complaints vocalized there. I haven't heard much of the same or any of that sort of thing from the Sami side of things. You'll tend to hear these like warm, fuzzy stories from the Frozen side of things about how Frozen was actually released dubbed in Sami, and that's so rare and it was so exciting. So you get like these happy feeling stories about Frozen, and from Moana you get a little bit more of people from those cultures saying, it's not how we tell these stories.
But that also may be in part because of the role that like Maui and Moana play, both in that culture and in the film, right? And whereas
Maui's a lot more important to the film than the Sami characters or the North Uldra characters are.
Yeah, they're more sort of background, and there's a promise of Frozen 3 and that they might be more prominent, and then we might hear more things. Right, because
yes, that rumored girlfriend of Elsa's might even be North Uldra herself. It's been some of the fun rumors.
And we don't know how Frozen 3 is going to deal with the fact that Elsa's a literal nature spirit either. That might also complicate some of this discussion, because if they make her not human in some way.
She's still somewhat human.
Yeah, we really don't know how that's going to go.
Are there any additional questions?
I think we've exhausted the pool of questions.
Yeah. We're sorry, but not that sorry for ruining. Yes, there will be a Frozen 3. It's already happening. We're sorry, but not that sorry for ruining your enjoyment of disposable Disney-themed paper goods.
Although we still endorse enjoying the films.
Yeah.
The article is technically a summer issue of The Lion and the Unicorn. It's a little delayed because publishing has just been delayed in general by 2020 as a concept and a problem. So it should be coming out this year sometime.
2020 as a concept and a problem, I think, is what I'm going to put on all my syllabi from now on.
Yes.
Any other questions? You can ask a question directly too. Don't be afraid. Oh, there's one from Robin, looks like.
Mur? So one of the joys of academic publishing is it takes a year for anything to happen. So will you be able to find a lot of literature that connects these films with eco-feminism? You'll be able to find some stuff on the first Frozen film. On Moana and Frozen 2?
Not yet. I'm sure it's coming. I'm sure it's coming.
Yeah.
But it's probably still in the plan somewhere.
Yeah. But you can find a lot of stuff about ecofeminism generally, and then you can relate it to those films.
I just want, sorry, I've just unmuted myself. Hello from the UK. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I just wanted to say, it's probably a shameless plug, and I'm really sorry, but myself and a colleague, we wrote a chapter on ecofeminism and Moana. So when I saw this presentation, I was like, oh my gosh, there's someone else, there's other people that have done this. So I'm really looking forward to reading your piece, because I think, yeah, we're like the only people that have written on it so far. So it will be really nice, because I haven't seen anything on Frozen 2 yet either, and only like a couple of things on the first Frozen. So it will be really great to kind of add to the literature altogether. So I'm really excited to read your article when it comes out, hopefully soon. Fingers crossed it will be in the summer.
Yes, thank you. It's very exciting again to hear. Yes, please do. If you could type in the chat bar there what book your chapter's in. Yes. I think you'd have an interested audience here, not just me and Sarah.
Yeah, it's always fun and exciting when you're like, other people are doing this too. At least one other person in the world is interested in this thing.
Book chapters can be hard to find sometimes, so it's nice to get a good direct reference to them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Google Scholar lies to me when I try to find things.
Yeah.
I appreciate the academic feeling of camaraderie. Someone else is doing this. And I like any research that is just spend some time on the Disney store. Yes. And look around and look at all the Frozen and Moana things.
Realize suddenly that all the nature themed things are on literally disposable products. That was one of our favorite parts of this project. Oh, just going, really, that's what they did?
Yeah, that was a realization. We're like, oh, that's a choice, Disney. Like, probably not, right? Probably not a like intellectual decision.
Unintentionally ironic.
But unintentionally ironic, and then just like, oh dear. Oh dear.
There are other questions? We have a couple more minutes coming up on the hour, about 7 or 8 more minutes. Anyone else?
Link.
Oh, yay. PDFs are good. I like PDFs.
Somebody whose label is just students said they did a similar analysis of string of picture books with fantasy and folklore in them and environmental themes. I'm glad we've caught you up. They said the earlier research was out of date and the presentation helps catch them up. It's very easy to get very quickly out of date, especially with this particular topic.
I know.
That's kind of good though. Means lots happening.
Yeah, children's media moves so fast now. But the good thing about Disney is there's always a picture book version. There's several picture book versions. There's a little golden book version. There's a scholastic paperback version. Like, if you wanted to stay with picture books and use this, they exist. And then you can be mad about the way that they're printed and the ink that's used and how it's all virgin wood pulp. We didn't even get into that, so. Yes. But do we think that there is overlap in disability and the stuff that we're talking about today? Yes. You want to say something smarter than that, Emily?
Well, we haven't looked into it specifically. I am sure it's there. I'm a little weak on disability studies in general. My next presentation actually has a line written into it saying, I need to look into more about the disability studies angle of this. References or help on this would be appreciated.
I'm both in terms of the way that pollution and environment disproportionately affect people with disabilities, and also the way that environmental degradation can make the social inequality of disability worse. Yes. yes, there is definitely overlap. But I don't have like good citations for you.
Are there any other questions or comments?
No? If you think of anything, the moment we all shut down here, of course, you're welcome to contact us. You can put our contact info in the chat. It was on our first slide, but I'll stick it down in the chat window too.
Yeah, that's a good plan. And we are both on the Twitter.
You know, pens weren't at the ready on the Twitter, although you were more responsive on the Twitter. I just sent that in a direct message.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I think that only came to me.
You know how to contact us already. There we go.
Yeah, that's my Twitter and Emily's email. I do also have an email, which I can put in here.
Which I also have Twitter. That's the ways in which we are most responsive.
Did I type that right? Yes, I did. I will answer email. I check it Monday through Friday. I check Twitter every 90 minutes or so. For being honest, more than I should. So I will likely respond to messages in Twitter more quickly than I will email. But if it's a long thing, then email is obviously more appropriate.
Yes, we're happy to chat about this outside of this context where you inevitably think of the best question ever 10 minutes later.
Yep.
No, thank you both so much for sharing your contact information and for doing this presentation. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. It was really great to have you all, a lot of great questions. So any final comments before we wrap up, either Sarah or Emily? Seeing a lot of hand clap emojis going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate. It's always exciting for academics to get to talk about their research with someone other than the people that live in their house.
So thank you all for being here and listening to us.
Yes. We're very excited to do this, and the people that live with us are sick of hearing about it. So.
Well, we're happy to give you a platform to talk to other people other than those you live with anytime you'd like. So you let me know. Well, all right. Well, thank you to everyone for being here. And thanks again to Emily and Sarah. I really appreciate you. Like, people from Germany too, it looks like. You've got a global audience. So I'm really, really glad that you all could be here. So have a great afternoon, I guess. There's nothing else. Yeah, bye everyone.